Welcome to today's episode of the Buzby Dog Podcast, where we're going to talk about kind of a strange phenomenon in dogs known as dead tail. It has several other synonyms, and we'll get into that, but I promised in an earlier podcast when I mentioned it that I would cover it in more detail. So here I am, keeping my promise. Dead tail hit home for me when my sister called and left me a voicemail and said, "Banjo's at the vet, call me when you can." So she lives 400 miles away, and it was a weekend, so I knew this had to be bad, but I also thought it was really strange because I had just talked to her the day before about her dog. She had recently adopted Banjo, who was a pointer lab mix, and already her family was head over heels in love with this dog. And he had been at the vet the day before and had a routine checkup, including lab work. And so I had spoken with her just to go over the lab results. She had told me that everything checked out great, and she was so happy that it was all well, everything was well. She laughed about the cost of dog ownership because this was new for her. She'd gone to the vet, they had done all these tests, but we both agreed it was worth every penny. So here she was in this crisis. So I get her on the phone and I say, "What happened to Banjo?" And she said, "We think he broke his tail." And you could just hear the sadness in her voice. And she went on to explain that he had been sleeping in her daughter's room and he had wagged it, they thought, into the daughter's iron bed. And now she said it's crooked. So this was her hypothesis on how the tail got to be crooked. She went on to explain what the tail looked like. And the further she got into the story, the more it wasn't adding up for me. First of all, I don't know that I've ever seen a dog break a tail by wagging it into something. And so the next question I asked her made me look like a clairvoyant. I said, "Was he in water yesterday?" And she stammered. She's like, "Well, I gave him a bath. Why?" And so normally I refrain from making diagnoses over the phone, but because my sister was so torn up and because she's family, I broke my rule and I said, "I think he has something called dead tail." Now, this is also known as swimmer's tail, frozen tail, limber tail, lab tail, and rudder tail. It's got a lot of names, but it's a really strange phenomenon. So what I was able to tell her is this is what I think is going on. And when she said the water piece, I felt even more confident. And I said, "Here's the bad news. It's excruciatingly painful, but the good news is he's going to be fine." I had never heard dead tail mentioned in my veterinary school curriculum. And incidentally, as a veterinarian, I figured that out early on in my career, like, whoa, wait a second, why didn't they teach us this in vet school? And this was one of those things. So as a newly minted vet, I would have missed the diagnosis when I first saw it in a patient, but an older seasoned colleague came in and saved me when I called him in for a second opinion because I thought, I've got this dog, he's painful in the hind end, there's a list of things that I could come up with that could cause that, but dead tail wasn't on the list because I'd never even heard of it. This condition is commonly misdiagnosed as a prostate problem, an anal gland problem, a fracture in the hind end, a disc herniation, so basically a back issue like a herniated disc, or even an infection. So a month after seeing that case, with my seasoned colleague who helped me through it, I was on my way back from actually my training to become a certified in veterinary acupuncture. So it was a long flight from San Diego back to the East Coast. And I struck up a conversation about dogs with a gentleman squeezed into the seat next to me on the airplane. He remarked that he was from California, and he remarked that he took his labs to the beach every weekend, and he asked me if I'd ever heard of swimmer's tail. I told him I'd seen one case, and I was embarrassed that he knew way more about it than I did. And so we continued to have a great conversation while we were eating our peanuts about what this was, and I learned a lot from him. And so the next day, I made a concerted effort to educate myself about this condition. And I was intrigued to learn that the precise cause isn't really known. We really don't understand it fully. But it appears to be related to damage to the muscles of the tail. For lack of a better word, almost like a sprained tail. So, as if to further cement this diagnosis in my head, I can't imagine I would have ever forgotten it after that, but my own dog ended up having this condition after a bath. And this was the only time in my life, I had the dog until he was, a senior dog. This was the only time in my life that I remember my dog trying to bite me, is when he had that condition and I was palpating his hind end. So for these dogs, the area around the tail base, where the tail meets the body, is very painful. They can't hold their tails normally. It often just kind of hangs limp and droopy, and they do not want to move it. It hurts to move it. Almost always, and oddly, there's this history of exposure to water, whether it be the ocean or a lake or dock diving, even a bath. Other predisposing factors that I read about in my research include heavy work, like a working dog working hard the day before, a dog being transported in a cage, maybe in the back of a truck, and again, maybe a hunting dog, and then cold water, or cold weather. But exposure to water has been the consistent common thread in the cases that I've seen. But it's not required to make the diagnosis. You don't have to have that piece of the history, because we do think there's other factors that can be related. So working dogs, such as English pointers, labs, and beagles, are the most commonly affected breeds, but it's thought to occur in all breeds. I have had a couple patients over the years, so now I've been a vet for 20 years, and I've seen, I don't know, maybe a dozen cases over the years, and I've had a couple patients, maybe 2, improve with manipulation of the sacrum, so an actual manual spinal manipulation, where there's kind of an instant relief for the dog. But for the vast majority of the cases, typically we treat with rest, tincture of thyme, and anti-inflammatories for the pain. So the good news is it just usually takes a couple days to recover, and that was certainly the case from Banjo. A couple days later, I got a message from my sister. Well, actually, very shortly thereafter, I got a message from my sister who said Banjo sacked out happily thanks to the pain meds. And then a couple days later, I got a message that he was once again happily wagging his tail into the furniture. So I think this is a really interesting diagnosis in dogs, and it's one that's just helpful for you to be aware of, because like me, when I was a newly minted vet, I didn't know what it was. So the good news is, whenever we see these strange things in our dogs and they're hurting and it breaks our heart to see them hurting, the good news is always to have an understanding of what we're dealing with. Certainly you're going to want to seek veterinary care, because I wouldn't want you to be trying to make the diagnosis on your own. That's not what I'm encouraging you to do. I just want to give you an awareness and help you be a little more intentional in your observation skills. But the good news is, it has a really good prognosis. The dogs recover and go on to do fine. Rarely I've seen a dog have dead tail actually more than once. And my hypothesis is that whether a dog be working or whether a dog be transported in a cage, as I mentioned, I found in a textbook as another reason that it can happen, or in water, dogs can use their tails like a rudder. One of the synonyms for this is rudder tail. And as they use their tail as a mechanism for balance, they end up overusing it. It's a completely different type and intensity of use than a dog who's just wagging their tail, and they actually cause an injury in the muscles of the tail. But like I said, they recover well with time. You do want to get the pain managed because it hurts immensely, but in the end, it's a happy ending. No pun intended.